G'day, brothers and sisters. Well, today we conclude towards maturity. We conclude our examination of the Gospel of Luke. And we're going to conclude by looking at two of the group resurrection appearances. Now, in the last episode, I detailed a list of reasons why we can have confidence that the resurrection of Jesus actually happened literally in time and space. But I want to say that ultimately, the conclusions you reach based on the evidence are ultimately determined by the presuppositions you bring to the table. If you start with the presupposition that there is no God and that miracles are not possible, then no amount of evidence or data will be able to verify for you that Jesus was indeed raised. But if you believe that there is a God and you believe that miracles are possible, then of course the historical information is strong and very, very convincing. Now, some people will work backwards. They will encounter the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and then come to the conclusion that there is a God. But as we look at these two group resurrection appearances, I want to reiterate the point that I made in the last episode. The disciples weren't expecting a resurrection. They were as much disturbed and they were as much perplexed by the original encounter with the empty tomb. And in the first group resurrection appearance, it is Jesus encountering two men, two of his disciples, who were on the road to Emmaus. Remember, the disciples had gone with Jesus for the Passover. So naturally, after the Passover had finished and after the disillusionment and the disappointment of the crucifixion of Jesus, some of his disciples started to return to where they were from. And presumably, they were obviously not only disillusioned, but they have to now get on with the rest of their life. They've got to go back to whatever they were doing. And we encounter two of them. It says that same day, two of them, and that same day, of course, is referring to the Sunday, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" Now, the village of Emmaus is about 11 kilometers from Jerusalem, so it would take you around an hour and a half to walk there, and there would have been many people traveling back after the Passover to their respective villages. So it shouldn't surprise us, or it wouldn't have surprised these two men to encounter somebody who was journeying in a similar direction to them. Though interestingly, at this point, they do not recognize who Jesus is, and that's important. They don't recognize who Jesus is because they are not expecting a resurrection. It was the furthest thing from their mind. That is how powerful and how life-changing the resurrection of Jesus was. Now, the sense of the Greek grammar that Luke uses here to describe their discussion as they are talking about the things that had happened over the last few days, the sense is that in their disillusionment, in their disappointment, in their great bewilderment, they're kind of arguing. This is a heated discussion. This is a lively discussion when Jesus comes up and converses with them. And look at what the text says. It says, they stood with their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, who we will hear about later on in one of the epistles of Paul, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know these things that have happened there in these days?" And I want to cast your mind to a point that we've been making right throughout our examination of Luke's Gospel. Jesus was a celebrity in his day. Everybody knew about the preacher from Galilee, or at least everybody in Judea knew about the preacher from Galilee, this great miracle worker. So when he was executed in Jerusalem, everybody would have known about it. Word would have spread that this same man who they had seen casting out demons, this same man who they had seen change water into wine, or raising the dead, or opening the eyes of the blind, his story had ended with a violent Roman execution. And this would have been amazing, that a righteous man could end his life, have his life ended by being executed. And that is the source of their great disappointment. Remember, they had thought that Jesus was the Messiah. They had thought that he was going to liberate them from the bondage of the Romans. And they give a passionate response to Jesus. They give this great description. They say, Jesus of Nazareth, he was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more is it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning but didn't find the body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. So they give him this great spiel about how they had gone to Jerusalem for the Passover, their great hope, their great Messiah had been crucified, and now they don't know what to make of the fact that there is an empty tomb. Now, I want to stress at this point, this demonstrates a healthy level of skepticism. As I mentioned in the last episode, people think that ancient people were just dumb, that they just believed in miracles. But notice, throughout all of the things that have happened, throughout the fact that the women have seen visions of angels, despite the fact that the empty tomb has been discovered, they do not come to the conclusion yet that Jesus has been raised. It was because nobody believed it was going to happen. Nobody in first century Judaism believed that there was going to be a Messiah who came and died for the sins of the world and came back from the dead. That is how foreign, that is how dramatic and radical the resurrection of Jesus is. And then Jesus begins to explain to them. He says, "How foolish are you and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken? Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Now, I want you to keep this in the back of your mind about how Jesus opened their eyes to the scriptures, because I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes' time. But then notice that at the end of the journey, they arrive in Emmaus, and then they persuade Jesus to come and stay with them. As I've mentioned before, hospitality was extremely important in the ancient world. Yes, they did have inns, but it was a cultural expectation that you would welcome in strangers and practice hospitality. You would welcome them into your home if they were traveling and allow them to stay, give them a fresh meal and give them a place to stay overnight. So it shouldn't surprise us that these two men would invite Jesus to come and stay with them, even though they think he is a stranger. And then it is in this meal that they have together at night where Jesus will break bread and he will reenact the communion sacrament, the sacrament which he had instituted on the night before he died in the event we call the Lord's Supper. And it is in this moment that suddenly when Jesus broke the bread, suddenly their eyes are opened to the reality that Jesus has indeed been raised from the dead. And then all of a sudden, in that moment, after Jesus has handed them the bread, he disappears from their eyes. Now, at this point, we need to get our heads around the reality that now that Jesus has been raised from the dead, he, in both his fully human nature and in his divine nature, he no longer has the limitations, the self-imposed limitations which he had placed on himself when the incarnation happened. Remember, when the incarnation happened, Jesus, we're told in Philippians, Jesus, who though being very nature God, took on the nature of a servant and humbled himself to death, even death on a cross. He took on the very nature of a slave, which meant that he did not use his divine attributes for his advantage. Now that he has been raised from the dead, he can go back once more to using his divine attributes. And this is an amazing picture that he appears and he stays with these disciples for a little while, but then he leaves them. And in this moment, they rush off and they go and they find the 11 and they announce to them that it is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon. Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke bread. And then I love this. The text goes on to say that while in that moment, while they were talking to the 11 disciples, Jesus appears to them and says, "Peace be with you." I want you to really ponder that phrase, "Peace be with you." This is the message of the risen Christ. God has come to bring peace. The Bible says that for God has so loved the world that He had given His one and only Son, so that none should perish. The message of the gospel is not bad news, it is good news. Yes, it is bad news for those people who reject it and who are perishing, but for those who receive it, it is a message of peace. And any person has the capacity to experience the peace of God and reconciliation with God. But it begins with encountering the risen Jesus like these disciples did. And then look at what it says. It says they were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. Again, I want to emphasize this. They still, despite the fact that the risen Jesus has appeared before them, their first conclusion is not that the resurrection has happened. Their first conclusion is that their eyes must be deceiving them. There are people who, as I've said, are so skeptical about the possibility of God rising from the dead. But I want you to notice that the disciples displayed that same level of skepticism. They did not, despite all the evidence that was brought before them, it still took them a long time to realize that the resurrection was actually true. They still thought it was a ghost. And Jesus says, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts rise in your mind? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I. Touch me and see, a ghost does not have flesh and bones as I have." And then it goes on to say that Jesus then showed them the piercing markings in His hands and in His feet. And then He asked them, "Do you have anything to eat?" Man, what a scenario this would have been. These men and women are encountering the risen Jesus, and He asked them, "Do you have anything to eat?" And then they give Him a piece of fish which He eats. But I want to emphasize how important this moment is. Not only does Jesus appear to the disciples, but He gives them many convincing proofs that He is actually alive. This is not just a spiritual resurrection. He's not just a ghost or a spirit. This is a physical resurrection. And they can touch Him. They can interact with Him. He still eats with them. And I want you to know that this is important, because remember, there is a beautiful mystery about the nature of Jesus and the incarnation. We talk about Jesus being fully God and being fully divine. The technical term is the hypostatic union. God becomes flesh. Jesus doesn't surrender His divine nature when He took on flesh, but neither when He is raised from the dead does He remove Himself of that human nature which He took on. So now forever and all eternity, Jesus will have these two natures, His divine nature and His human nature. And even after the resurrection, He still eats. He is still physical. He still has a body. And this is the hope of the resurrection, that we too one day will have a physical raised body just like Jesus is, just like Jesus does. And the amazing thing is that as they could touch Him, the language here is very, very reminiscent of John's Gospel. In the first epistle of John, John will say these words, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched. This we proclaim concerning the Word." So when we notice Jesus' language here in Luke's Gospel, where He says, "Look at my hands and my feet, touch me," this was something that the early church really, really held onto. And John recognizes that the resurrection narrative of Jesus wasn't just some myth. No, the disciples had actually seen it with their own eyes, and they had beheld and they had touched Jesus as a convincing proof that He had indeed been bodily raised from the dead. And then it goes on to say that Jesus says to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. And then he will go on to say, this is what is written, the Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. So we get here a precursor to the final commission, the marching words that Jesus will give to his disciples, which are recorded for us not only in Matthew 28, but also the instructions, the commission that is given in Acts chapter 1. But 3 times here in this chapter, we get a reminder here that the events that Jesus has fulfilled through his death and resurrection were predicted. They were spoken about in the Old Testament. He says in the law of Moses, which is the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. He says that it was predicted in the prophets. Now, when we think about the prophets today, we tend to think about the classification of prophets known as the major prophets, which is Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, and we tend to then think of the minor prophets, books like Hosea, books like Joel, Amos, Malachi, Zechariah, etc., Jonah, and the like. But the prophets in Jesus' day were regarded, yes, as all of those names that I just listed off, but the classification of the prophets was wider. The prophetic books also had a classification known as the former prophets. These were books like Joshua, books like 1 and 2 Kings, books like 1 and 2 Samuel, books like 1 and 2 Chronicles. These books, although they didn't necessarily focus on the prophetic figures or the sermons of the prophets like we have in the other books, these books were not only considered to be historical books talking about God's dealing with his people, but these books were said to be things that pointed towards what God was going to do in the future. And Jesus was giving his disciples a great theological lesson, and how incredible that would have been to get this information from the greatest teacher of all time. This is a hermeneutic that Jesus gives to his disciples to show them that the Old Testament points ultimately to him. And this is a reminder to us that we shouldn't neglect the Old Testament. Part of growing in discipleship, part of growing towards maturity, is to look at the whole corpus of God's word to us and all of the books which have been revealed to us, because we find Jesus. And we can see now that all of human history is converging on these 3 days, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus, that the story has been about Jesus from the very beginning. And no matter where we look in the Old Testament, now the light bulb has gone off. We can see the hand of Jesus. The story is pointing towards Jesus. When we think about Genesis 1 and the creation of the universe, that language is temple language. It's the creation of the temple where God will meet his people. Ultimately, we see that fulfilled in Jesus. When we think about the promises to Abraham that he was going to have descendants, and from his descendants there was going to be a blessing to all the nations, we can see that Jesus is that promised blessing. We can see that when they came out, when the nation of Israel came out of Egypt in the book of Exodus during the Passover, we can see that Jesus is leading a new Passover. The story of the Exodus only makes sense now that we understand the story of Jesus. When we think about those instructions, those detailed instructions in the back end of the book of Exodus, talking about the building of the tabernacle and how God's presence would dwell in that tent of meeting that Moses built. Now we have the presence of Jesus coming to take up residency in our hearts. All of the Old Testament makes sense only now in light of Jesus. Think about the great promises given to King David that one of his descendants, this great Messiah, would rule over the throne of Israel forever. And think about the great prophets like Isaiah who predicted the suffering servant, or Daniel who saw the Son of Man coming on the clouds and approaching the Ancient of Days. All of this has been fulfilled in Jesus. The words of Jeremiah when he talked about the new covenant, the words of Ezekiel when he talked about God replacing the heart of stone and replacing it with the heart of flesh. All of these things Jesus says is being fulfilled and has been fulfilled in his life. So brothers and sisters, we can't just just ignore the Old Testament. The Old Testament has so much influence on how the New Testament itself was constructed. And we have to understand that the reason why the Old Testament had that influence is because of the words that Jesus said when he was raised and how he explained the meaning and the significance of the Old Testament. And I just want to close that after this, we realize that when we read the book of Acts, we know that that is volume 2 of Luke's 2-part collection. Acts, the Gospel is volume 1, and then Luke's and the book of Acts is volume 2. But we notice there that Jesus spent 40 days with his disciples. And remember that that number 40 is significant. It was a number which signified God preparing his people. So the reason why Jesus spent 40 days with his disciples is because he was preparing them. But then we know that Jesus ascends to heaven, and this is how Luke closes out his gospel. He says, when he had led them to the vicinity of Bethany, he lifted up his hands and blessed them. While he was blessing them, he left them and was taken up to heaven. Then they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and they stayed continually at the temple praising God. So the narrative ends with them returning back to Jerusalem. They will wait in Jerusalem for a brief period until Pentecost happens and the Spirit comes, and then from there they will go out and preach the gospel to the ends of the earth. But before Jesus leaves them, he ascends into heaven. And the ascension of Jesus is so important. You know, we shouldn't minimize the significance or the importance of the ascension of Jesus. It is extremely important. Just like we prioritize the meaning of the cross, and just like we prioritize the meaning of the resurrection, we have to prioritize the meaning of the ascension. You know, the ascension is not just Jesus going to be at the right hand of the Father because he has nothing better to do. No, the ascension is Jesus taking his rightful place on the throne so that he may rule over the cosmos. The eternal God, the eternal Father, Son, and Spirit rules over the cosmos. And Jesus in the ascension is not only demonstrating and declaring his victory, but now he rules over the cosmos and he has sovereignty over all of our lives. You see, Jesus is the king over the believer and the unbeliever. And one day, Jesus will return, and that rulership will be proven and demonstrated before the eyes so that nobody can doubt or disbelieve any longer. And as Paul says in the book of Philippians, in his letter to the Philippians, he says that one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess Jesus is Lord to the glory of God. And this is what is said in the book of Hebrews. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets, and at many times and in various ways. Again, this echoes what Jesus was talking about, how the Torah and how the prophets and how the Psalms and the writings were pointing to him. And then this text goes on to say that, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through him also he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. So here we have Luke concluding his gospel with the important ascension of Jesus. So now the King of the universe, who came and took on flesh, all the way back in chapter 1 when the announcement was given to Mary, and then you had the virginal conception. Now this God who came in to the world via the womb of Mary has now taken his place after he was glorified, after he was lifted up at the cross, and after he came out of the tomb. Now he takes his place back on the throne at the right hand of Majesty, where he will remain until his second coming. Well, God bless you, brothers and sisters. It's been a delight. It has been a privilege to journey with you in this series toward maturity, and I've been so blessed to take you into a deeper dive throughout the Gospel of Luke. I hope this has blessed you. I hope it has encouraged you. And I hope that through towards maturity, you've grown closer to God. And I encourage you to keep going through the scriptures, keep studying it, keep meditating it and keep going with diligence and be diligent in your prayer life, because that is the only way that we can go toward maturity. God bless you, brothers and sisters, and I hope to see you down the road somewhere.